Hope you like Japanese literature, because that's the majority of what I'm reviewing today. Hi, I'm Ben, welcome back to my channel and to my reading wrap up for the month of May. I read 7 books in total in May, and most of that was done while I was on holiday in Japan. I was there for 3 weeks in total and it was amazing. There will be a Japan reading vlog, holiday vlog kind of thing coming soon, but I do just need to find the time to edit together the many hundreds of little video clips that I took while I was away, many of which are of food because the food was just spectacular. But editing together a vlog just takes so much time. I actually still haven't done my Sicily vlog from last year, and that was like September. Anyway, let's crack on with the reviews. The first book that I finished in May was actually one that I read mostly in April, and that was Home Fire by Kamila Shamsie. I read this for the April prompt of the Read Good Challenge, which was to read a former winner of the Women's Prize, and I've had this on my shelf for quite a while because I think I found it in a charity shop a few years ago, but I just hear amazing things about it, so I was excited to give it a go. And I tell you what, it is a banger. This story is about 3 siblings in a British Pakistani family and their experience of radicalisation and ISIS. It's told in 5 parts. We get 1 section from the perspective of each sibling and then 1 each from 2 other characters' points of view. This worked so well for me because we start off with Isma, who's the older responsible sister, and she has to take care of her siblings and fill in the mother role after their parents die. And from her we get this very reasoned, reasonable point of view. The opening, by the way, is fantastic. It's her experience of going through the airport as a Muslim. It's just searing insight and top-notch establishing character work. But in her chapter, what we see are these really frustrating, inexplicable behaviours from certain characters. You wonder why they're acting the way they are and what on earth has happened to get us to this point. And what the structure of this book allows Shamsie to do is get us really deep into the headspace of those characters to properly understand what makes them tick and why they do what they do, why they did what they did. And I think this works a lot better for the story than if we just like alternated chapters between the different characters. All that time spent with each one made me so emotionally invested. And what that meant for me was that by the end of the book, I found the ending so emotional and perfect. It had just the right amount of surprise and ambiguity, and I really cared for these characters. When I was reading this, I couldn't help but bring to mind the news story in the UK about a woman called Shamima Begum. She was a young British Muslim who went to Syria when she was 15 to join ISIS, but she has since said that she wants to come back but has been stripped of her citizenship, and that leaves her effectively as a citizen of nowhere. I'm not sure it was an explicit influence on this book or if that story came after this, but they seemed very similar. A story that definitely did influence it though was Sophocles' Antigone, which at one point I did know this was a retelling of, but it completely left my brain until I got to the acknowledgements. I think I'm kind of glad that I didn't know and wasn't familiar with the original story, because it did allow this book to surprise me quite a bit. For instance, Isma's younger sister Anika has a section that just emotionally wrung me out, and I'm not sure it would have hit as hard if I knew what was coming. Overall, a brilliant book, I think a very worthy winner of the Women's Prize, and it makes me really interested to read more Kamila Shamsie. Next, I read Mongrel by Hanako Footman. This is a debut novel from the Japanese-British author, and it's another book with multiple perspectives, except in this one we move a little bit more frequently between them. There are 3 women whose points of view we get. May, who lives in London with her father and stepmother following the death of her mother. Yuki, who moves from Japan to the UK in pursuit of her dream of becoming a concert violinist and finds herself smitten with her violin teacher. And Haruka, who works as a hostess in Tokyo bars and grieves the loss of her mother, who died taking secrets with her to her grave. First off, I thought the writing was really beautiful and so impressive for a debut author. It has this sense of gravitas, and there's almost like a folklore tinge that made everything seem really important and weighty. And that makes sense because family histories are important to the families that experience them. So I thought this created a great sense of resonance between the form and the story. My only small gripe with the style was that dialogue was done in a slightly odd way that I've not seen before. It was in these like indented, italicized blocks, like separate from the main prose text. and I felt it was maybe a little bit unnecessary. It distracted more than it added, and I think I would have just preferred standard dialogue. The story was very intricately plotted. You start off getting the lives of these first two characters, and then maybe halfway through Haruka is introduced, and throughout you just feel their stories intertwining, the knots tightening, and it all feels intentional and satisfying as it all comes into focus. I thought that was really, really well done. And it tackles a lot of big, interesting themes like identity and belonging, leaving home and what home is when you're away for so long, when you lose or don't have the language of your heritage, when you don't have a relationship with the family you left behind. And it also looks at sexuality and power dynamics and abuse, and it tackles sex work and art and privilege and racism. Honestly, there's so much stuff stirred into the pot that it's surprising how not messy this book is. It feels really well honed. Over the course of the novel, we learn more about each character's backstory, and there are definitely some moments of surprise and some satisfying reveals. I thought this was such an accomplished debut, and I was really, really impressed with it. Then I read Diary of a Void by Emi Yagi, translated by David Boyd and Lucy North. This one is about a woman who, quite frankly, is treated like shit by her co-workers. They expect that it will fall to her to fetch coffee for a meeting, and it's her job to clean it up after everyone when they're done. She gets understandably very sick of this and starts pretending to be pregnant in order to get people around her to treat her with a bit more dignity and respect. And she lets this go on for ages. This book is basically the diary of her whole pregnancy, and the name of the novel in Japanese is actually a play on the name of a booklet that expectant mothers in Japan are given to chronicle their own pregnancies. Anyway, at first she is just like stuffing a scarf in her top to try and appear a bit more pregnant, and doing what she can do to bat away her strangely concerned co-worker Higashi Nakano. But over time, things get a bit weird, a bit ambiguous, as she actually starts to put on weight. She fills herself with an unusual hunger, and she even starts going to antenatal classes and to doctor's appointments. I found this book pleasant enough, and the satire was quite funny, but I didn't get much more out of it than that. There's probably something to be said about the roles we carve out for ourselves and how we morph into them, which reminded me of another Japanese novel I read last year called The Factory. The author's name has completely gone out of my brain. But yeah, other than that, it hasn't really massively lodged itself in my brain, but it was an okay way to pass some time. Next, I read Confessions by Kanae Minato, which is translated from Japanese by Stephen Snyder. This was a book recommended to me by someone on Instagram, I think, but I ended up flipping through it in a bookshop in Tokyo, and while I was looking at it, Matt mentioned that it had been turned into a really good film that we should watch. And so it was quite expensive in the shop, but it was quite cheap on Kindle, so I ended up getting an ebook copy and I started it right away. I think it's a little bit hard to explain this book, but I will give it a go, starting with the first chapter. So the setup of this chapter is that it is a monologue from a teacher called Ms. Moriguchi, who is speaking to her class on her very last day ever as a teacher. And she's decided to leave the profession not long after her young daughter has died, presumed at the time to be an accident, but as she has discovered, what is actually a murder perpetrated by two pupils in her class. We only get her dialogue as she takes the class through what her understanding is of what has happened, and she reacts to some things that are happening in class, and she drops a few bombshells along the way. At the end of that chapter, I thought, right, okay, this is a collection of short stories, because the chapter kind of stood alone. It did have a conclusion. I felt that was the twist in the tale, and that was the end of it. And it reminded me a little bit of Roald Dahl's short stories. As a side note, Roald Dahl short stories for adults are really, really good. They're very twisted and brilliant, and I would highly recommend them. A definite comfort read for me. But I got it completely wrong, because this is not a short story, because the rest of the book is a series of chapters told from the perspectives of a bunch of people related to what happened. We get a girl in the class who's a bit of a swot, and she fills us in on the annoying teacher that has replaced Miss Moriguchi and the bullying that goes on in the wake of all the revelations. There are chapters from the pupils implicated in the murder. There's a chapter from one of their mothers, as well as a few others that I can't remember right this second. But yeah, I enjoyed this. I thought it was a real wild ride full of interesting reveals. None of them completely shocked me, but they were all well done and well earned. What I liked most, though, I think, is how much re-evaluation goes on throughout the book. We think one way, or a character thinks one way about themselves, until we learn something else in a subsequent chapter. You think someone is reasonable until it turns out they're not, or you think of someone as a bad person until we learn more about them. And the characters themselves think this too. Their chapters are full of self-rumination, wondering if they're to blame for this or that, not certain what the actual truth is. And that all felt very real and authentic to me, because nothing is ever as black and white as we see it in popular culture. And it was really interesting to me to have this very realistic ambiguity in this book, because a lot of the plot points are completely ludicrous. I liked how those two things played against each other. Overall, I thought it was plenty of fun, depending on your definition of fun, and it has an interesting dive into human psyches, and the ending was an absolute blast. The next book I read was In the Miso Soup by Ryu Murakami, translated from Japanese by Ralph McCarthy. Someone described Ryu as the better Murakami, which made me laugh, but I've always noticed this book in bookshops and I was keen to give it a go. This is about a man called Kenji, and it's told in first person from his perspective. And Kenji is a tour guide that lives in Tokyo, specialising in helping foreigners visit his city for sex tourism. He will help them find the right, or rather wrong, streets and establishments, and bridge the language gap for them and help them find what they're looking for in this sprawling Japanese metropolis. When we meet Kenji, he's just taken on a new client, this American man called Frank, who found his advert in a magazine. And Frank is a bit of a strange man, which may be underplaying it a little bit, but he says strange things, he seems close to losing it at points, and makes these odd faces, including a particularly scary one that Kenji likes to call the face. At the same time, there is news happening about this spate of murders that's been going on around the city. A woman's body is found in bin bags one night, and a homeless person is found set on fire another night. These are quite disturbing murders, and Kenji starts to wonder if Frank's arrival in Japan is somehow connected to them. I liked the writing in this a lot. It came out in the 90s in Japanese, but it really does read like a contemporary English language novel. There is nihilism in spades as we explore the seedier side of Tokyo, and there's so much tension between Kenji and Frank that you find it hard to read, but you can't look away. This tension builds up to a moment in the book, which I will warn you is not for the faint of heart. And when you're reading this horrifying scene, the prose is so good that you get this very uncomfortably clear view of what is happening. I really can't describe it much more without spoiling it, but let's just say I read it with my jaw wide open and my stomach turning. After that scene, I think the air gets a bit sucked out of the novel, and I didn't find the remaining part of the book all that satisfying. There is still some tension, but it feels quite drawn out, and there's a lot of reflection and rumination, and the themes are really interesting, like about loneliness and isolation, but I just found myself getting a little bit bored towards the end. Overall though, I think it is a really good book for freaks like me out there who can stomach it. Then I read Strange Weather in Tokyo by Hiromi Kawakami. This was translated from Japanese by Allison, Markin, Powell. And this one I chose for a couple of reasons. First, it's just one I've had on my shelf for a really long time, and it's nice to rescue a book from that sort of shelf graveyard. Second, I had seen this billed as magical realism, and so it fit the magical realism prompt for the Read Good challenge. This story is about a woman called Tsukiko who is in her 30s, and despite lots of social pressure, she lives alone, she doesn't have a family yet. But one day she runs into her old Japanese teacher, who she just refers to as Sensei throughout the book. Sensei is in his 70s and a traditional old man. He's very well put together, he's always wearing a suit, he's carrying around a briefcase, and they enjoy each other's company more than they expect. And so they start hanging out as friends at this local sake bar. It's a short little novel told in episodes of their relationship, as they go on hikes or fall out over baseball and slowly become closer and closer. At this point you might be wondering, wait, didn't you say this was magical realism? And while reading it, I felt exactly the same. I was wondering when Tsukiko was going to float home like she does on the cover of the book, or when it was going to be revealed that they were like talking telepathically this whole time. But none of that happens. There is one small slither of magical realism where they both enter this strange dream world together, but that's about it. I have to admit, this book just didn't really do it for me. The prose is really sparse and frank and clean. I think Sasiko's inner wrangling with her feelings is believable, but it felt a little bit too threadbare for me to be massively invested in it. It's definitely pumped full of that mixture of melancholy and whimsy that a lot of Japanese fiction has, so I think if you like stuff like Before the Coffee Gets Cold, you'll probably like this too, but not a massive hit for me. Finally then, I read The Offing by Benjamin Myers, and this was a book I picked up, one, because I love Benjamin Myers, and two, because the Savage Reads prompt for May was to read a book by an author with the same first name as you. I'm not actually a Benjamin, but Ben is close enough, so I'll take that. I think this is my third Benjamin Myers book, and both of his previous ones I gave 5 stars, so I was going in with very high expectations. I actually did a standalone review for his book Cuddy because it was so good and really deserved some time spent discussing and thinking about it. So if you want to see that review that I did, I will link that in the description. But I won't hold you in suspense any longer. This book is brilliant. It's about a teenager called Robert Appleyard, who is the son of a coal miner up in Durham, and he's expected to follow in his father's footsteps. But in the wake of the Second World War, he just wants to get out of his village and see more of the world. And so he does, on foot. We actually start the novel with a few pages from him as a much older man, reflecting on his life and memory and mortality, before he jumps into his recollection of that summer, as he treks through fields and villages, doing odd jobs for families missing the young men in their own households in exchange for room and board. The nature writing in this part is absolutely beautiful. I think nobody does nature writing in fiction quite as well as Benjamin Myers does, and it just transports you and it makes you sort of see the streams and hear the wildlife. I just thought it was absolutely beautiful. Anyway, this carries on for Robert until he stumbles upon the home of Dulcie, an older woman who lives alone with a dog called Butler, who you will definitely fall in love with. Dulcie is sharp-tongued and she's witty and she's abrasive, but there's something about her that is intriguing and endearing, and Robert finds himself wondering why she lives alone, what it is that she's been through that her neighbours in the village mention, and why she's happy to let her cottage's view of the sea become so overgrown and obscured. Robert then finds himself always one day away from leaving. He'll go after this small job he does for Dulcie, and then there's another one, and that one takes longer than he thinks, and then there's one more job to do. He is, of course, just stuck in her orbit, wanting to spend time with her because he feels at home. And there's a bit of a comedy of manners aspect to all of this. Robert is too polite to accept the food that he's being offered, and Dulcie clearly wants him to stay, but brusquely assumes that he'll leave tomorrow. But the meta conversation between them is really easy to read. Robert feels at home and he has a purpose here, and Dulcie enjoys his company and wants him to stay. Over the course of the book, we learn more about Dulcie's past and her relationships, her love and her heartbreak, and I just found it extraordinarily moving. She really is the star of this book. I think if you liked Sarah Winman's Still Life, you'll absolutely love this one. There's that intergenerational friendship vibe, but also just a warmth and generosity in the prose that I think is just really beautiful. Another 5 stars for Myers from me. That's all for this wrap up, but before you go, I did want to try a little something. If you have made it this far into the video and you noticed the fox in the background, leave me a fox emoji in the comments, and if you didn't notice, well, leave me a cat emoji instead. As ever, I'd love to hear from you in the comments if you've read any of these books and what you thought about them, or if your interest has been piqued by my reviews. If you liked this video, please do give it a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos from me, then hit the subscribe button and you'll get a video about once a week. But until next time, toodles!